What do the Imperials want with the child? Why do they seem so adamant on acquiring him in Season 1, and why were they trying to extract materials from him? Today we are looking at the post-Endor Imperial remnant and what they could possibly want with the Star Wars franchise's newest adorable character, the child. In Season 1 of The Mandalorian, we were introduced to Din Djarin, the titular Mandalorian, who was assigned to hunt down a very specific bounty for an old Imperial holdout. This bounty was kept undisclosed both to the Mandalorian as well as us, the audience, being one of the biggest surprises of last season. Episode 1 of last season ended with the introduction of the child, or colloquially known among fans as Baby Yoda. This was a massive surprise and was a spoiler that was kept secret even up until the release of that episode. Ever since then, fans have all been asking the same questions, wondering where he came from and what the Empire wanted with this innocent child. Well, thanks to the most recent episode of The Mandalorian, we finally may have the long-awaited answer for this question. This episode saw the return of Dr. Pershing, the character we saw taking care of the child in Season 1 of The Mandalorian. Remember that The Mandalorian spared Dr. Pershing in Episode 3 of The Mandalorian, and he was totally absent when The Mandalorian returned to Navarro in Chapter 7, implying that he'd either been killed by the client, played by Werner Herzog, or that he had somehow managed to escape. This episode confirms that he did in fact survive and is continuing to perform experiments with the sample that they had gained from the child. In Season 1 of The Mandalorian, there were many theories about what the Empire wanted with the child, with some pointing out that Dr. Pershing bore on his shoulder patch a symbol that was very similar to the symbol worn by the Kaminoans, famous for their cloning technology. Many assumed that this meant that Baby Yoda was, in fact, himself a clone. However, it was implied that he was not when we found out that he was not a strand cast in Chapter 7 of The Mandalorian. However, we also learned recently that a strand cast and a clone are different. Even still, this most recent episode of The Mandalorian does confirm, or at least imply, that the child is not a clone, yet also giving us a reason for why Dr. Pershing would have a cloner's patch on his arm. In this episode, we see a large room filled with terribly grotesque test subjects that have been mutated and deformed with growths coming out of all parts of their body, somewhat similar to what we saw the vats in Palpatine's chamber in The Rise of the Skywalker, where we saw him growing Snokes. Despite the visual similarities, I'm not entirely sure whether the two are connected, but there is something that we can be sure of. In that room, we find a recording of Dr. Pershing, recorded 3 days before the episode took place, telling the Mandalorian that Dr. Pershing and Moff Gideon are in fact still alive. In the recording, Dr. Pershing explains that he has been using the blood of the child in transfusions on these test subjects, resulting in these horrible and grotesque mutations. The goal of these mutations is somewhat veiled, however, I do think there's a really good explanation. You see, Dr. Pershing references the donor's M count. We know, of course, that the donor is actually the child, a rather unwilling donor at that, and M count seems to harken back to our old and most favoritist of clips from The Phantom Menace.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
That's not how the Force works.
Referring, of course, to one's midichlorian count. It is now undoubtable that these Imperials are trying to transfer midichlorians from one subject to another. It seems logical enough, if midichlorians really do live within the blood, that taking the blood of someone with a high midichlorian count and putting it into someone with a low midichlorian count would increase their ability to use the Force. Of course, these experiments are not going according to plan, as instead of just gaining Force abilities, these test subjects are instead growing mutations and tumors and other numerous sorts of terrible and uncomfortable looking side effects. This tells us for certain that the Imperial Remnant is trying to harness the ability to manufacture Force sensitives. Whether they want to use this on themselves in order to empower the Imperials or create an army of Force sensitives, or even if they are somehow involved with the creation of Snoke, I cannot know for certain yet. However, there is something incredibly nefarious and game-changing going on with this. It is incredibly bold for the creators of The Mandalorian to be delving into the science of midichlorians, as this was one of the most unpopular elements of George Lucas's prequel trilogy, and was actually going to play a very large role in his sequel trilogy, with the sequel trilogy said to dive even more strongly into the science of the midichlorians. Here we see that they are not referred to by midichlorians, but simply by their abbreviation M. Still, the reference is very clear, and they are trying to take the midichlorians from the child and infuse them into test subjects, willing or otherwise, in order to learn the secrets of creating Force sensitives. The Mandalorian is now becoming incredibly game-changing in the galactic landscape and what we understand of the Star Wars universe. And it is possible that they are doing this in order to set up the creation of Snoke, who we know is a Strandcast being grown by Palpatine. And we also know that Force-sensitive clones are incredibly rare. And while Snoke wasn't a clone himself, but instead a Strandcast, which is a genetic creation that did not have a host, it still would be reasonable to assume that the child could be the source of Snoke's power, or even the source of Rey's power. However, the deformation of the test subjects would seem to imply that being imbued with a midichlorian transplant does do terrible and grotesque things to the body. The only reason why I hesitate to say this is it seems to me that Disney is deciding to ignore the sequel trilogy. Rather than retconning it, they are simply taking the large heat that it is getting to pretend that it doesn't exist.
I will inflict upon the genophage the greatest insult an enemy can suffer: to be ignored.
However, I could be wrong, as The Mandalorian is proving here by introducing midichlorians that they are not afraid to take something that is controversial and largely hated by the Star Wars fandom and try to turn it into something cool. But anyway, that is everything I have for you today on why the Imperials actually wanted the child and what they plan to do to him. What do you think about this new revelation that this is, in fact, what the Imperials were trying to do with the child? I actually called this a year ago in Messages with Dash. I've got a screenshot here, and he told me that he's not sure that that's how midichlorians work, and I said that is absolutely how midichlorians work, at least according to Darths and Droids, which is basically the Star Wars prequels retold as if it was a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I'm letting my nerd show. All right, I'm done talking about that. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, because as always, I want to know what you, my friends, have to say about our favorite galaxy far, far away. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, may the lore be with you, now and forever.